Last week in chapter 29, just to give a quick recap here, we saw Jacob's arrival in Haran and his meeting with Rachel at the well, and his introduction to Laban, who Laban is his uncle and the father of Rachel. We saw Jacob's love for Rachel and his desire to marry her, and we saw the trick that Laban played on Jacob by having him marry his eldest daughter Leah after Jacob had worked for 7 years thinking that he was going to marry Rachel, but Laban plays that trick on him, and so Jacob then has to work for a further 7 years in order to marry Rachel as well. And then at the end of chapter 29 we had the account of four births that Leah experienced, her first 4 sons who were mentioned there. There was Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, the first 4 sons. And Rachel was barren. Rachel was unable to have children, and we noted also this relationship between Rachel and Leah, that Rachel was the wife whom Jacob loved, and Leah was not appreciated, not loved in the same way that Rachel was. So we continue into chapter 30 this evening. What we see here at the beginning is a continuation of the account of Jacob's children and the various other sons and the one daughter who are born to him. So we're going to read here Genesis chapter 30 verses 1 to 8. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister, and she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I shall die." Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Then she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah, go into her, that she may bear upon my knees, and even I may have children through her." So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went in to her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again, and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and have prevailed." So she called his name Naphtali. Rachel, as we've mentioned, was barren and unable to have children, and when she saw that her sister Leah was bearing these sons for Jacob, she became envious of her. She demanded that Jacob should give her children, she says, "or I shall die." This is an indication of her desperation in her desire to have children, that she thinks death would be preferable if she can't have children. Jacob became angry with her, telling her that it was not in his power to undo what God has done. He says, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? So how can I do anything about this? I'm not God, I can't sort this out." So Rachel then does what Sarah had done when she was unable to bear children for Abraham. Rachel gives Jacob her maid Bilhah as a surrogate mother, saying, "Go into her, that she may bear upon my knees, and even I may have children through her." As Bilhah was Rachel's maid, she was in effect the property of Rachel, and so any children that Bilhah bore would then be regarded as Rachel's children. That phrase that she uses there, that she may bear upon my knees, it was an indication that any child that would be born would be acknowledged by Rachel as being her child. So this was the plan, and the plan worked, and Bilhah conceived and she gave birth to a son. And we notice again that it is Rachel who names the child here, calling him Dan, because she says, "God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son." So she regards this son Dan as being her son. She saw this as God's answer to her pleas for a son, that God has judged in her favour. The name Dan means he judged, and so it's an appropriate name that she gives to the child. Bilhah then conceived again, and she gave birth to a second son, Jacob. And this time Rachel named the son Naphtali, which means wrestled. And Rachel says, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed. So there's this ongoing sort of competition between Rachel and Leah as to who can bear Jacob these children. I read on here verses 9 to 13, which goes on in chapter 30. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, good fortune. So she called his name Gad. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, happy am I, for the women will call me happy. So she called his name Asher. So when Leah realized then that she was no longer bearing children for Jacob, she did the same as Rachel had done, and she gave her maid Zilpah to Jacob for him to have children through her. Again, these children would be regarded as Leah's children. Zilpah's first son was born, and Leah gave him the name Gad, meaning fortune. At his birth, Leah had proclaimed good fortune, or the authorized version in verse 7 has her saying, a troop cometh. There's some uncertainty over the meaning or the translation here and the meaning of the name Gad, but it most go with that idea of it meaning fortune, or this is my good fortune that I've had this son Gad. Zilpah then gave birth to a second son, and at his birth Leah had proclaimed, happy am I, for the women will call me happy. Leah's happiness on this occasion is reflected again in the name that she gives to this child, and she calls this child Asher, which means happy or blessed. Reading on further in the chapter, verses 14 to 21, we have this. In the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, give me, I pray, some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also? Rachel said, then he may lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her, and God hearkened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Leah said, God has given me my hire, because I gave my maid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar, and Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good dowry. Now my husband will honour me, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter, and called her name Dinah. So despite the births of all of these sons, there was still some tension and some rivalry between Rachel and Leah. And although Rachel had had children through her maid Bilhah, she still wanted to have a child of her own. So a situation then arose at the time of the wheat harvest, and the wheat harvest took place sometime between May and June. When Leah's first son, the firstborn, Reuben, found mandrakes growing in the field, and he brought them to his mother. Mandrakes were plants which people in the ancient world believed had properties which would aid fertility. The plant was of the nightshade family. It has broad leaves, thick root, a violet flower, and produces yellow fruit. We'll see some pictures of it in a moment. And it's said to have hallucinogenic properties as well. So many different superstitions developed around the mandrake. So Rachel asked Leah then if she would give her some of Reuben's mandrakes, these plants that Reuben had found in the field, in the hope that they would help her to conceive. Well, Leah reacted abruptly to this request, saying, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" So we see Leah still feels that she's been the neglected wife in all of this, and that Rachel has taken away her husband, and now is she going to take these mandrakes as well? So Rachel came to an agreement with Leah that Jacob could sleep with her that night in exchange for some of these mandrakes. We got some pictures here of the mandrake plant, and it shows the roots and the leaves and the fruit on there, and then flowers, and then finally here's the fruit. Doesn't look very appetizing, but that's apparently what it looks like. So these are the mandrakes then, which Rachel is given in exchange for allowing Leah to sleep with Jacob that night. So that evening, when Jacob came in from the field, Leah went out to meet him and told him of this agreement that she and Rachel had come to, that he was to sleep with her. And this would really explain why Leah has not had any more children, that Jacob was not sleeping with her, so she's not been able to have any more children up to this point. So God now hearkened to Leah, and as a result Leah conceived, and she bore Jacob a fifth son. This time Leah said, "God has given me my hire, because I gave my maid to my husband," and she named this child Issachar, which means hire. Again, the name has a connection with the circumstances here. Leah then conceived again, so this just wasn't a one-night stand here, but Leah then conceived again, and she produced a sixth son for Jacob. And now she said, "God has endowed me with a good dowry. Now my husband will honour me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And the sixth son was then named Zebulun, meaning honour. After this she bore one more child. It was a daughter, whom she named Dinah, and her name means judgment. So in total then Leah had borne Jacob 7 children, 6 sons and 1 daughter, Dinah. Well then verses 22 to 24 says this: "Then God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, May the Lord add to me another son." So finally then God remembered Rachel and listened to her prayer and enabled her to bear a child of her own. She had a son, and she said, God has taken away my reproach. So now that she has born a son, the shame, the humiliation was removed from her, that she had been unable to have children. And she named him Joseph. The name Joseph means he adds, and she asked, may the Lord add to me another son. So she's expressing her hope that she would have another son. And she does, as we'll see later, she does go on to have another son named Benjamin. But sadly she dies in childbirth, in giving birth to Benjamin. But that's a story that we'll come to another time. Joseph, of course, is the one who becomes Jacob's favourite son, and we'll see much more about him later on in the book as well. So move on now to verses 25 to 36, and the story continues here. When Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know the service which I have given you. But Laban said to him, if you will allow me to say so, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it." Jacob said to him, "You yourself know how I have served you, and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly. And the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?" He said, "What shall I give you?" Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again feed your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later when you come to look into my wages with you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen." Laban said, "Good, let it be as you have said." That day Laban removed the he-goats that were striped and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in charge of his sons, and he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. So following the birth of Joseph, then Jacob asked permission from Laban to return to his homeland. He's still really very much under the control of Laban. He's still working for him, and so he has no right just to go off. He needs to ask permission from Laban in order to leave. Jacob had served Laban well for 14 years, and now, feeling his obligations have been fulfilled, he is ready to return home to Canaan. So he asks Laban's permission to allow him to leave, taking with him his wives and his children. And Laban would have still been exercising some sort of authority over his own daughters, so it's important that Jacob get this permission to leave. However, Laban is unwilling to let Jacob leave. He says that he has learned by divination that the Lord has blessed him because of Jacob's presence. So understandably, then he wants this association with Jacob to continue. And so he tells Jacob to name his wages and he will pay him. Laban had made that same offer right back in chapter 29, verse 15, when Jacob had first come to him, that Laban had said to him, "Tell me, what shall your wages be?" And again, that was when Jacob asked for the hand of Rachel in marriage. So Jacob relates here the story of how he has served Laban well, and how Laban has prospered since Jacob has been working for him. That before Jacob came, Laban had little, but now, as a result of Jacob's service and his efforts, Laban has been blessed abundantly. His flocks have increased greatly. So through Jacob, the Lord has blessed Laban in this way. But now Jacob asks, "When shall I provide for my own household also?" Laban has benefited from Jacob's service, but Jacob now wants to provide for his own family. So he's been given all this service to Laban, and he doesn't really have much himself, and so he wants to be able to build up his own wealth in order to provide for his own household. So Laban again asks, "Well, what shall I give you?" And Jacob doesn't want any gift from Laban, but instead he proposes that he should be allowed to go through the flocks and remove from them the speckled and spotted sheep and goats and the black lamb, so these ones that had different markings upon them. And he says that he would take these for his wages, and so this would then allow Jacob to build up his own flocks. So selecting these spotted and speckled creatures would also be Jacob's way to ensure that he's not falsely accused of stealing any of Laban's sheep or goats. Because later, if amongst Jacob's flocks there were goats that were not speckled or spotted or not marked, or any lambs that were not black, then these would be counted as being stolen. However, that day Laban separated the speckled and spotted goats and the black lambs from the rest of the flocks, and he put them in the charge of his own sons, who were then sent 3 days' distance between them and Jacob, so that the separation occurs with the flocks here, that Laban has pulled out all of these animals that are marked or speckled or spotted in some way, and he's separated them. So in this way, Laban is trying to deny Jacob any of the sheep and goats. So if all the ones that are left are plain white ones, then Jacob doesn't have any. He's going to have to start from scratch and build up his own flock from nothing. But Jacob continued then to look after Laban's flock for him. And Laban's really hoping, well, that this situation will continue, and Jacob is then going to be in his service for longer. Jacob won't be able to build up his own flocks in this way. If we read on in the story, verses 37 to the end of the chapter, verse 43, we read this: Then Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane, and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the rods. He set the rods which he had peeled in front of the flocks in the runnels, that is, the watering troughs, where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the rods, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped, and all the black in the flock of Laban, and he put his own droves apart, and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob laid the rods in the runnels before the eyes of the flock, among the rods. But for the feebler of the flock he did not lay them there, so the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man grew exceedingly rich, and had large flocks, maidservants and menservants, and camels and asses. So we've got rather a strange account of something going on here, but we see that Jacob was not deterred by Laban's tactics in separating out the speckled sheep and goats for himself. Jacob here used a method to encourage the flocks to breed and to produce these striped, speckled and spotted animals, which to us seems unscientific and superstitious. That he takes some branches from these different trees, the poplar, almond and plane trees, he peels away some of the bark to expose white streaks on the branches, and then these rods are laid in the water trough, so that when the sheep come to drink the water and to breed, they see the stripes on the rods, and so they produce young which are striped or speckled. However, the appearance of the offspring cannot be controlled by what the adult saw whilst it was breeding. There was a sort of superstitious belief, even into more recent times, that if a pregnant woman saw something, that what she saw would have influence upon her unborn child, and would develop some sort of characteristics where she saw. And this seems to be the idea that is happening here. What is actually happening, though, is controlled by genetics. And whether Jacob knew anything about genetics, we don't know. So it's rather a strange account here. But anyway, it works, and these animals produce these striped and speckled sheep and goats, and so Jacob is then able to separate them from the rest of the flock, and these are his. We notice he also used a method of selective breeding as well, that when he saw the stronger animals breeding, he would put the rods in front of them to encourage them, but then when the feebler animals were breeding, he would not put the rods in front of them, and so allowing them to breed naturally, and in this way he was able to produce stronger animals for himself, whilst Laban was left with the weaker ones. And so Jacob's flocks grew, and he became exceedingly rich, we're told, with maidservants and menservants, also with camels and asses as well. So Laban's attempt to deny Jacob the opportunity to develop his own flocks had failed, and Jacob was blessed by God in doing this, that in keeping to the agreement he had made with Laban, God was blessing him and making him prosperous. So we come to the end there of chapter 30, and a couple of questions perhaps to think about from this chapter. Do you think Jacob was justified in the methods he used to increase his flocks? And how is God's hand at work in the events of chapter 30? How do we see God at work through these events with the children that are born, and also with the increase in Jacob's flocks there? Perhaps something to think about.